My name is Renata Vidal, and I was 31 years old the Thanksgiving my uncle announced to the table that I had wasted my entire 20s. He didn't preface it. He didn't lower his voice. He said it the way you'd say the weather had been disappointing, matter of fact, slightly resigned, as though it were simply a condition everyone at the table had already privately agreed on. Renata has no plan. She never did. Some people are just like that. My mother didn't correct him. My aunt refilled her wine. I picked up the bread basket and passed it to my cousin, and I kept my face exactly where it was. What none of them understood, and I mean this in the most literal sense, they did not have the information, was that I was, at that moment, 48 hours away from sitting at that same table with different guests. A follow-up gathering my mother had planned for the weekend. And one of those guests was going to read something aloud that my family had never seen, had never thought to ask about, and that had my name at the very top of it. 43 names on that document. Mine was first. I'm getting ahead of myself. But I want you to know from the beginning that I was not nervous about what was coming. Not even a little. There are careers that photograph well, and careers that don't. Mine doesn't. I have been a public health field investigator for the State Department of Health for 10 years, and in that decade, I have never once been able to explain what I do at a family dinner in a way that made anyone lean forward. The words themselves work against me. Field investigator sounds like either a television show or something vaguely bureaucratic and forgettable. Public health sounds like a poster in a waiting room. Put them together and watch the eyes glaze in real time. I've seen it happen to people who genuinely love me. My mother will nod carefully, the way she nods when she's waiting for the sentence to end, so she can redirect to something she understands. My uncle, her brother, Tomas, will make a sound that isn't quite a word and then say something about his son's dental practice, which everyone agrees is a real job with a real building and a real sign on the door. I don't blame them for not understanding. Public health infrastructure is genuinely invisible until it isn't, and when it isn't, when the thing it was built to prevent actually happens, people notice the emergency, not the years of work that ran alongside it. That's the nature of the job. You succeed quietly, and you fail loudly, and the quiet successes don't have press conferences. What I do, in plain terms, is this. When there is a disease outbreak, foodborne illness, a cluster of respiratory cases, an unusual pattern of illness in a community, I am one of the people who goes into the field to find the source. I interview patients. I collect samples. I trace contacts. I map transmission chains. I coordinate with laboratories and local health departments and, when necessary, with federal agencies. I write the reports that determine whether a contaminated product gets recalled, whether a facility gets shut down, whether a school reopens or stays closed. I have been doing this since I was 22 years old, first as a junior investigator and, for the last 6 years, as a senior field investigator with a caseload and a team. None of this appears in any photograph on my social media because the nature of the work prohibits most documentation and because the scenes I work in are not scenes you photograph for personal record. They are scenes you document for evidence. I grew up in a large, close, opinionated family in a mid-sized city in the Southwest. My mother, Cecilia, was the eldest of 5 siblings, which meant that family gatherings were populated and loud and organized around a specific social physics in which status was communicated through the legibility of your professional life. My uncle Tomas had a son, Marco, who is a dentist. My aunt Pilar had a daughter, Sofia, who was a civil engineer. These were the benchmarks. These were the names that got used in the particular way that names get used when they are functioning as illustrations of something. My name, Renata, had been used as an illustration of something too, just the other kind. I had not gone to medical school, which had been the plan briefly when I was 18. I had changed direction in my second year of university when I took an epidemiology elective and felt the specific recognition of finding something that fit. I finished my degree in public health. I went into field investigation. I had not acquired, by my 30s, the visible markers, a practice, a title with a specific building attached, a salary that could be referenced at a table, and so I had been filed, somewhere in my family's collective accounting, under the category of potential not yet realized. For 10 years, I had not corrected the file. Not because I was ashamed of the work, because I had come to understand, slowly and then all at once, that the correction would require a conversation my family wasn't equipped to have. They would nod. They would redirect. They would return to Marco's dental practice and Sophia's bridge projects, and I would be back where I started, just with more words spent. So I spent my words elsewhere. On case reports. On outbreak investigations. On the documentation that made up the actual substance of my professional life, in rooms and fields and laboratories that had nothing to do with my family's dining room. The two worlds had never met. Until the weekend of Thanksgiving. Before I get to the table, I want to tell you about my grandmother's neighbor. Her name was Dolores Reyes, and she had been a public health nurse for 30 years before she retired, and she was the first person who had ever looked at my work with the specific quality of recognition that comes from someone who had done the same kind of work in a different era. My grandmother, Abuela Consuelo, had lived 3 houses down from Dolores for 22 years. I had been having Sunday meals with my grandmother since I was small, and Dolores had been coming over for coffee on those Sundays for most of that time, and somewhere in my mid-20s, after I had been in the field for a few years and had started to understand the shape of what I was building, Dolores had become the person I talked to about it. She was 74 by the time this story ends. Sharp in the specific way that people who spent their careers paying close attention stay sharp. She noticed things, she remembered details, she asked follow-up questions weeks after a conversation, as if she'd been turning the information over in her mind the whole time. She had worked through 2 major regional outbreaks in her career, one in the 1980s and one in the early 2000s, and she talked about both with the particular mixture of professional pride and institutional grief that you develop when you've seen what happens when the system works and what happens when it doesn't. She was the one who, when I was 26 and frustrated after a particularly difficult case, had said, "The work doesn't care if your family understands it. The work cares if you do it right." I had written that down somewhere. I still had it. Dolores had also, over the years, quietly tracked my career in a way my own family had not. She knew my title. She knew my caseload. She had, at some point, through the particular information networks of retired public health professionals, which are surprisingly active, learned about the citation that would be presented at the Regional Public Health Conference in late November of that year. She had mentioned it to my grandmother in October. My grandmother had mentioned it to my mother. My mother had not mentioned it to me. She had, instead, invited the Regional Commissioner of Public Health, a man named Douglas Arriaga, who had been with the State Department for 21 years and who sat on the conference committee, to the small post-Thanksgiving gathering she had planned for the Saturday of that weekend. She told me this on Friday evening, the day after the main dinner. I want to describe my reaction to finding this out because it matters for what comes later. I stood in my mother's kitchen and absorbed the information that Douglas Arriaga was coming to lunch the next day, and something in my chest did not move at all, not with surprise, not with anticipation, just a stillness that felt like the confirmation of something I had been carrying so long I had stopped noticing its weight. My mother looked at me carefully when she told me, "Dolores mentioned the conference." I looked it up. A pause. I should have asked sooner. I said, "It's fine." She said, "I know it isn't entirely." We left it there. We had Saturday to get through first. Thanksgiving in my family was a 2-day affair in the years when my grandmother was well enough to host. Thursday at Abuela Consuelo's house, which was the formal dinner, and then a secondary gathering on Saturday at my mother's house that was smaller, looser, and theoretically a way to use the leftovers, but was actually just an extension of the social event. The Thursday dinner that year had 22 people at 2 tables pushed together in my grandmother's dining room. Abuela Consuelo at the head, my mother to her right, Tomas and his wife Gloria to her left, Marco and his wife at the far end, Sofia and her husband, various cousins and their partners, children. The specific beautiful noise of a large family that actually likes each other most of the time. 10 years. He absorbed that. Nodded with a particular quality, not unkind, but the nod of someone doing a calculation. "And you like it?" The Friday between the 2 gatherings was ordinary. I went for a run in the morning. I called a colleague about a case that was still active. I helped my mother with the shopping for Saturday's lunch, and we talked in the car about logistics and did not talk about Tomas's comment and did not talk about Douglas Arriaga. The not talking had a specific texture, not avoidance, but a mutual decision to let Saturday carry what it was going to carry without rehearsing it. In the late afternoon, I sat at my mother's kitchen table and looked at the email from my director one more time. The subject line read, Regional Recognition Citation, FY Citation List Confirmed. The first name in the body of the email, under the heading Distinguished Field Investigator Citation, was mine. I closed the email. I made tea. I watched the neighbor's dog investigate the back fence for 10 minutes. I was not nervous. My mother's Saturday lunches were smaller affairs, 8 to 12 people, typically, a table that fit everyone in the same room. She had, this particular Saturday, invited Dolores, my grandmother, my Aunt Pilar and her husband, and Douglas Arriaga, whom she had introduced in the invite, with a restraint I appreciated, simply as a colleague of Renata's from work. Tomas had also been invited. He arrived with Gloria at noon, still wearing the easy authority of a man who had set a thing at Thursday's table and expected it to remain set. I arrived at 11:45 to help my mother set up. I was wearing the same kind of thing I always wore to family lunches, dark slacks, a clean sweater, nothing that announced anything. I put out water glasses. I folded napkins. I was entirely ordinary. Douglas Arriaga arrived at 12:15. He was 61, with the compact efficiency of a man who had spent decades coordinating large-scale public health responses and had learned to move through social environments without consuming excess space. He shook my hand when I let him in, and he said, Renata, in the tone of someone who knew my file and was pleased to meet the person behind it, and I said, Commissioner Arriaga, thank you for coming, and that was the full extent of any acknowledgement between us. We both understood the architecture of the afternoon. My mother introduced him to the table as a senior administrator from the state health department. Tomas shook his hand. My Aunt Pilar asked if he wanted sparkling or still water. The lunch proceeded. The food was good. The conversation was the particular mix of a gathering where not everyone knows each other, careful, a little formal in the early phase, warming as the meal progressed. Douglas was easy company. He had the politician's gift of genuine interest, or something that read like it, and he asked Pilar about her engineering work in a way that made her lean forward and explain things she clearly didn't usually get to explain. He asked Dolores how she knew the family. She told him. 30 years as neighbors, retired public health nurse, she mentioned, and he said, What years? And when she told him, his eyebrows went up slightly, and he said the name of one of the regional outbreaks from the early 2000s, and she said, Yes, I was in the field for that. And there was a moment of quiet professional recognition between them that the rest of the table watched without fully understanding. Tomas, by the midpoint of the meal, had begun doing the thing he did at gatherings where he was not the most professionally significant person in the room, a subtle recalibration, a listening quality that he didn't usually wear. He was paying attention to Douglas Arriaga in the way you pay attention to someone you are retroactively trying to understand. I ate my lunch. I passed the serving dishes when they needed passing. I was very calm. At 1:30, my mother brought out coffee and a small dessert, and the table settled into the easy post-meal looseness that means the formal portion of a gathering is winding down. Douglas put his coffee down. He looked across the table at my mother and said, Cecilia, I hope you'll forgive me for bringing a small piece of business to lunch. My mother said, Of course. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and produced a folded document, cream-colored, official, the state seal visible at the top when he unfolded it. Something at my table went entirely quiet. The document was a formal citation from the Regional Public Health Leadership Conference. Douglas held it in both hands and looked around the table before he spoke. The State Department of Health, together with the Regional Conference Committee, issues an annual Distinguished Field Investigator Citation to recognize investigative work that has materially contributed to public health outcomes in our region. He was reading from the document now, his voice carrying the specific register of someone who has read official language enough times to give it warmth without losing its weight. This year's citation recognizes 43 field investigators across 8 regional jurisdictions. He looked up from the document and directly across the table at me. The lead citation, the name at the top of the list, is awarded to the investigator whose documented caseload, outcome record, and regional contribution the committee ranked highest across the past citation period. This year, that citation goes to Senior Field Investigator Renata, State Department of Health, in recognition of 11 documented outbreak investigations closed in the past 24 months, 4 of which resulted in statewide regulatory action, and one of which, a fractional pause, was submitted to the Federal Centers for Disease Control and Prevention as a reference case investigation. He set the document on the table, facing me, and slid it across. "Congratulations," he said. "The department is proud of your work." The room did not make a sound. I reached forward and took the citation with both hands. I looked at it. I kept my face exactly where it was. I said, "Thank you, Commissioner. I'm glad the work was useful." Douglas picked up his coffee. At the other end of the table, Tomas had both hands flat on the tablecloth, and his mouth was not quite open and not quite closed. My Aunt Pilar had a look on her face that was working its way towards something. Her eyes had moved from Douglas to me and back to Douglas, recalculating. Gloria, Tomas's wife, was looking at the citation as if she could read the contents from a distance, which she could not. My grandmother, seated to my left, put her hand over my wrist. She did not squeeze it. She just rested it there, which was enough. Dolores, across the table, looked at me with the particular expression she had been carrying since Thursday evening, the expression of someone who has been waiting patiently for a thing to happen and is pleased that it has happened in exactly the right way. My mother refilled everyone's coffee. Her hands were steady. She had known this was coming, had arranged it, and was now receiving it with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who had planned something correctly. Pilar spoke first, after the silence had run its course. "Renata, for statewide regulatory actions." "Yes," I said. "From outbreak investigations." "That's the process," I said. "You find the source, you document it, and the regulatory action follows." She nodded slowly, the nod of an engineer encountering a system she hadn't previously mapped. I didn't know you did that level of work." "I know," I said. "I haven't been great at explaining it." Tomas cleared his throat. He picked up his coffee cup. He put it down without drinking from it. He looked at the citation, which was still facing me on the table, and his jaw moved in a way that was not speech and not its suppression but something in between, the look of a man deciding whether the thing he is thinking is something he is willing to say out loud. He decided to say it. "I didn't know," he said. His voice had lost the expansive quality it carried at Thursday's table. It was smaller, more careful. "I said, at dinner Thursday." "I know what you said," I told him, quietly, not with heat. He was quiet for a moment. "I was wrong about it." "Yes," I said. Another silence.
"I'm sorry, Renata."
I looked at my uncle across my mother's lunch table, and I considered the 10 years behind me, the cases, the reports, the 4 a.m. drives to field sites in counties whose names my family couldn't have placed on a map, the regulatory meetings and the laboratory calls, and the particular exhaustion of work that matters and goes unseen. I considered the bread basket on Thursday. I considered my grandmother's hand on my wrist. "Thank you," I said. "I appreciate that." And then I picked up my coffee because the lunch was still happening and there was still dessert on the table, and what I wanted, more than any prolonged reckoning, was to sit in a room where my work had just become visible, and let that be enough. The gathering dispersed around 3 o'clock in the natural way of family lunches that have reached their completion. Douglas Arriaga stayed for 30 minutes after the meal formally ended, and he and Dolores had the conversation I had suspected they would have, comparing notes on a regional epidemiology initiative from the early 2000s, exchanging names of people they'd both worked alongside, doing the quiet professional archaeology that retired and active public health workers do when they meet. My mother brought them more coffee and left them to it. Pilar found me on the back porch, where I had stepped out for some air. She came and stood beside me for a moment without talking, which was unusual for Pilar, who was a person who filled silences efficiently. "Federal reference case," she said finally. "Yes. They put your investigation in the federal case library." "A summary of it?" "Yes." She was quiet for another moment. Then, "Why didn't you ever say?"
I thought about how to answer that.
"I tried a few times when I first started. You all nodded and moved on. So I stopped trying." I looked at her. "That's not an accusation. It's just what happened." She received that with the directness she gave most things.
"Fair," she said.
"Then I want to understand it better if you're willing.
I'm willing, I said.
She asked good questions, standing on my mother's back porch in the thin November afternoon light. The kind of questions that come from a structural engineer's mind. How does the system work? What are the inputs? What are the failure modes? What does success actually look like? And how do you measure it? I answered all of them. It took about 20 minutes. By the end, she was nodding in the particular way she nodded when she'd mapped a new system and was satisfied with its logic. That's real work, she said. It is, I said. She went back inside. I stood on the porch for a few more minutes with my coffee. The November air was cold and clean and completely ordinary. A good afternoon. Tomas left without saying anything further to me specifically. He said his goodbyes to my mother and my grandmother and gave me a brief, careful nod at the door that carried in it everything he wasn't going to elaborate on in that moment. I nodded back. It was enough. These things don't resolve in an afternoon. They don't need to. My grandmother found me in the kitchen as the last people were leaving. She held my face in both hands for a moment, something she had done since I was small, the specific benediction of a grandmother who expresses love through contact rather than words. Her hands were very warm. She looked at me for a long moment without speaking. Then she said, 43 nombres.
El primero.
43 names. The first one. Sí, abuela, I said. She released my face and went to help my mother with the dishes, and I stood in the kitchen doorway and watched them for a moment. These two women who had shaped me, moving in the easy, practiced choreography of a kitchen they had shared for 30 years. I put the citation in my bag carefully, folded around the cream-colored document with the state seal, and I helped with the dishes. The change in my family was not a dramatic event. It was a recalibration, the kind that happens when a fixed assumption turns out to have been wrong, and the people who held it have to quietly rebuild their picture of a person they thought they already understood. Tomas called me 3 weeks after Thanksgiving. He was not comfortable on the phone, which I had always known about him, and the call had the quality of something he had been preparing for and was relieved to finally make. He asked about my work. I gave him the short version. He was 63 years old and had spent his life in construction management, and the vocabulary was genuinely different, and I did not need him to master it, just to know that it existed. He listened. He asked one clarifying question about how outbreak investigations got initiated, who called, who went, how it worked. I explained it. He said, "That's serious work," and I said yes, and there was a pause that had a different quality than his pauses usually had. Not avoidance, but genuine consideration. Before he hung up, he said, "I've been saying the wrong thing for a long time. I want to correct it." I said, "I know. Thank you." He corrected it in the way my uncle corrected things, not with a formal announcement, but by changing what he said. My cousin Isabel called me in January and mentioned, in passing, that her father had told her about my investigation work and the federal citation. He made it sound impressive, she said. Like, genuinely. There was a note of surprise in her voice that I found, under the circumstances, forgivable. My mother and I talked about Thursday's dinner once, directly, about a month after the fact. She said she should have corrected Tomas at the table. I told her I understood why she hadn't. It would have required explaining things she didn't have the full vocabulary for either, in a room of 22 people, in the middle of Thanksgiving dinner. She said that was generous of me. I told her it wasn't generosity, it was just accuracy. She accepted that. She also told me that she had looked up my department's public case database, which publishes summaries of investigation findings without identifying information, and had found, she thought, for cases that matched the regulatory actions Douglas had referenced. She had read all 4 summaries. She had not mentioned this to me when she read them, which I appreciated. She had needed to do it privately, at her own pace, without it becoming a presentation. "I didn't know the scale," she said, "of what you've been doing." "I know," I said. "I could have done better at explaining it. We could have done better at asking," she said. "We were even on that, and we both knew it." The regional conference citation was framed and sitting in my apartment by December. It was a straightforward document, cream paper, official seal, my name and title, and the summary of the citation criteria. I put it in my home office on the wall next to my desk, where I could see it from my chair. Not for guests. For me. as a marker of a specific moment when the work became visible in a room where visible mattered. Dolores came to my apartment for coffee in December, the first time she had been to my place in the city rather than at my grandmother's house. We sat at my kitchen table and talked for 2 hours. She told me about a case from her early career that she had never fully resolved, a cluster of respiratory illness in a rural county in the 1980s that the epidemiology of the time hadn't been equipped to fully explain, and that she still thought about. I told her about a case from the previous year that had nearly gone sideways because of a gap in the reporting chain between a county health department and my state team, and how we'd ultimately closed it. We talked about the systems and the gaps and the places where the machinery held, and the places where it was held together by the specific competence of individual people working past the edge of their official job descriptions. It was one of the better conversations I'd had in years. Before she left, she looked at the citation on my office wall. She read it without commenting. Then she turned to me and said, "Your uncle, did he actually apologize?" "He said he'd been saying the wrong thing," I said. "For Tomas, that's a full apology."
She thought about this.
"That's something," she said. "It is," I said. She put on her coat. At the door she said, "Your grandmother is proud, you know. She's been proud the whole time. She just didn't have the words for it either." I said I knew. I thought about that for a long time after she left. The year turned. The work continued. Cases opened and closed. A particularly complex foodborne outbreak in the spring took 6 weeks to trace and resulted in a product recall that I was not able to talk about publicly and did not need to. The recall itself was the record, and the record was enough. The following Thanksgiving, at my grandmother's house, was 20 people instead of 22. The same 2 tables. The same mole, the same sweet potato dish. Tomas made the toast this year. He stood and raised his glass and talked about the family, about my grandmother's health, which had been variable, and was that year good, about being grateful for the room. And then, at the end, he said, "I want to say something about Renata, because I said something last year that I should not have said." He looked at me across the tables. "She does important work. Work that keeps people safe." I didn't understand it, and I said something stupid, and I'm glad I know better now. 20 people looked at me. I kept my face where it was. "Thank you, Tio," I said. He sat down. My grandmother nodded once, to no one in particular, with the economy of a woman who considers a thing settled when it is settled. Marco, from across the table, leaned over and said, "What actually happened at the lunch?" Nobody told me the full story. "Long version or short?"
I said.
"Long," he said. Isabel's boyfriend, now her fiancé, a fact that had happened somewhere in the intervening year, passed me the bread basket from his end of the table. "You want to start with the citation, or with the Thanksgiving before?" I asked. "The Thanksgiving before," Marco said. "Okay," I said, and I told it. The thing about being in public health is that you spend your career making arguments you can't fully make in public. The work is documented. There are records, reports, regulatory filings, a federal case library with a summary bearing my name, but the documentation is technical and specific and does not translate easily into dinner table conversation. The public health infrastructure that keeps a community safe is genuinely invisible when it's working. That's not a flaw in the system. That's the system doing what it's designed to do. The cost of that invisibility is personal, and I have made my peace with it. The work does not require an audience to be real. It required me to be competent, to be thorough, to follow the chain of evidence wherever it led, and write the report accurately, and let the regulatory action be the outcome rather than the recognition. That was the job. I did the job. What I did not do for 10 years was give my family any real information about what the job entailed. I have thought about this a lot, and I have come to an honest accounting of it. I stopped trying to explain because I was tired of the nod and redirect, and the tired made me quiet, and the quiet allowed their assumption to calcify. That was my contribution to the misunderstanding. It was not equal to my uncle's contribution. He spoke with certainty about something he had not measured, but it was real, and I own it. The Saturday lunch was not something I engineered. I want to be clear about that. My mother arranged it. Dolores provided the information that made it possible. Douglas Arriaga came because my mother asked him to, and because he thought the work warranted the recognition. I showed up and let it happen. But I had also, for 10 years, done the work that made it possible. The citation existed because the investigations were real. The investigations were real because I had chosen at 22 to follow the thing that fit instead of the thing that photographed well, and had kept following it through every dinner party and family gathering where it went unnamed, and through every field site at 4 a.m. where the only people who knew what was happening were the people in the room. That is the version of the story I want to remember. Not the table, not the silence after Douglas read the citation, not my uncle's changed face. The field work, the cases, the documentation. Everything else was just the moment it became legible. That is my story. A cream-colored citation, a breadbasket, and 10 years of invisible outbreak work. Here is what I want to ask you, and I've been thinking about this since that Sunday lunch. When someone dismisses your work at a family table, not cruelly, just confidently wrong, do you correct them in the moment, or do you wait until the room corrects it for you? And which one is harder? Drop your answer in the comments. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.